Welcome to What I've Learned, the podcast which talks to child protection practitioners in development and humanitarian settings about community-led approaches. If you're a practitioner who's trying to find ways to strengthen community ownership of child protection, or perhaps you're just interested in learning more, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Lucy Hillier. I'm a child protection advisor living in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I focus on participatory and community-led approaches for child protection. As part of this, I run an initiative called the Community Child Protection Exchange, which develops innovative ways to help practitioners build their skills as facilitators of a community-led approach. Each episode, I talk with an expert from the child protection world, and we hear about their unique experience of community-led child protection and what they've learned along the way. We talk to academics and researchers, program advisors and field staff from all over the globe and discuss real-life examples of how different communities have led their own child protection. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Glynis Clacherty, who's a South African Zimbabwean published researcher and expert in participatory methodologies and research with children and adults. We take a deep dive into an amazing and enduring child-led project called Tatu Tano in rural Tanzania, and we unpack how children with the right sort of support can lead their own successful protection initiatives.
I think for me, this project and other projects I've seen that have been led by children, there's a feeling that they can do this.
In this episode, we'll be speaking with our guest, Dr. Glynis Clacherty. Glynis is a long-time child protection and MHPSS researcher and advisor and has worked across the African continent and many regions. Glynis has a particular focus and expertise in participatory methodologies and has worked for many years with children and communities in a whole range of settings, including long-term development, with refugees, for children on the move, and children affected by HIV, just to name a few. Today, Glynis is going to tell us about a really inspiring example of a child-led protection initiative in Tanzania, which she's been involved with for many, many years. We'll be unpacking some of the key issues around the idea of what it means to say a program is child-led, and we'll be looking at aspects such as the role of the agency in a child-led program, how can we ensure child safeguarding, and whether a program like this can even be sustainable. So welcome, Glynis.
Thanks, Lucy. I think it's really exciting that you're making a series of podcasts so that we can tell our stories.
Thanks so much for coming, Glynis. You've got a whole wealth of learning and knowledge in you, and I'm really keen to unpack it with you today. Before we get into the specifics of the work that you've been involved in Tanzania, can you just tell us perhaps what led you down this path of working in a participatory way, and then later focusing on community-led approaches?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and I now live in South Africa, and I've worked all my working life in different parts of Africa. And I started off, and a lot of the work I do even now is participatory research with children. And some of the early work that I did was particularly interesting because I was in South Africa at the time of the move towards democracy and the creation of new laws and policy within South Africa. So it was a particularly exciting time to be involved in research with children, because children were included and young people were included in a lot of that participation within civil society. So I was involved in some really exciting projects that looked at, for example, the gun laws in South Africa. I had done some research on children and violence, and I was asked by the advocacy lobby to come and present that research. And it influenced the parliamentary committee that I spoke to. And eventually that was fed into what are very progressive gun laws that we have in South Africa. So I've really been privileged, I think, to work in the South African context and be involved in that kind of work. But that kind of work and a lot of the other research that I've done, mostly more recently with migrant children, I've tried as much as I can to make the research involve the children and for their voices to be heard. So I've thought a lot about my power as a researcher, and I've used lots of art-based methodologies to let children tell their own story in their own words. And I've started to think quite a lot about how a lot of the research that I've done has fed into programs. So I would do something for an NGO with migrant children, and they would develop a program in response to what the children had said. And I started to think, well, how can we make the programs also listen to the children's voices? How can we make not just the research that we do, and then the NGO creates a program, and that's taken back to the children we researched with? I started thinking, how could we make that kind of more child-led approach to research go into programming? So that's kind of a little bit of the story of how I got into thinking about child-led programming.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Glynis. So in fact, your journey into participatory approaches and later on into this sort of community-led type approach, child-led approach, is really rooted directly in the history of South Africa. And I think it is really a good point that you make, that often we think about, and a lot of people do research with children, but it doesn't tend to always continue in that approach doesn't continue because children are not necessarily given that space or power to then develop a program that they want to develop. That often goes back to the agency. So your work in a way has gone a step further and tried to give a bit more space to those children to actually lead the initiatives, the actions that they want to take, and for the agencies to maybe take a bit more of a back seat, which is very exciting because it's not the norm. And today we're going to really unpack the project that you're going to tell us about in Tanzania and learn a bit more about how this actually can happen. So do you think, Glynis, you could give us just an overview of this child-led protection initiative in Tanzania that you've come to tell us about today? How is it set up? And perhaps at the same time, try and answer the question of, can or should children actually lead programs about their own well-being and safety?
So maybe just to answer the second half of that, I think they definitely can. And this project in Tanzania, I think, is an exemplary example of that. I also have seen other programs in other places. And I think what's important to keep in your mind about what do we mean by child-led, there's a wonderful definition by Reddy and Ratner, who wrote some of the early work on participatory work with children. And they talk about programs that are child-initiated and directed. And I think those two words are quite interesting, that the children initiate the project and they direct the project, and the adults are supporters. So that's kind of how I understand a child-led program. So to tell you a little bit about the program in Tanzania, I've been involved with the program not from the very beginning, but sort of 5 or 6 years into it. It started in 2000, which was a time when in northeastern Tanzania, where HIV and AIDS were a huge issue for the community and for children in particular. A lot of adults had died from AIDS, and there were a lot of orphan children left in that area, either living with older sisters and brothers, or living with their grandparents. So it had a huge impact on the community. And those children the orphan children were mostly very poor because the households had lost the person who was the economic head of the household, the person who brought in the income. But they also experienced at that stage, and I think it's maybe lesser now, but they experienced really strong discrimination from the rest of the community. So they were very much the outsiders and stigmatized within the community. And someone who became a friend Kurt Madarin, Dr. Kurt Madarin, who's or Kurt, as we all call him, who's a sociologist, was living in one of the villages in Nshamba at the time. And he started thinking, what could we do to respond to the situation of children? He had his own young children at the time, and some of them became friends with the other children. And he started to think, what could we do? So interestingly, he got 17 children, different ages, together, and he spent a week with them in somewhere in Nshamba. And he started by asking them, what do? You children who live without parents, what are you particularly good at doing that other children don't do? I'm sure you've got strategies that you have to make you've got to be, have initiative and do things to make your own lives. And he started with their strengths. And then they had discussions about that, what they did really well. I mean, they had to get themselves up for school in the morning. When they got home from school, they sometimes had to cook their own lunch, etc. Then he started to say, well, what could you do to make your lives a bit easier? And the children came up with this idea. We want small groups. If we can help each other, if we have a little group, because a lot of them were very lonely because they'd been kind of discarded by the community. So other children didn't want to play with them. So they said, if we could all get together in little groups of 3 or 4, we could support each other. We could be there when somebody's sick. We could come and help them. We could also work together to cut grass, which is something the children did to earn money. We could hire ourselves out as a small group to someone to dig their field. So we could be more effective in making a living if we work together. And then the children also said something that I think is so interesting, and why, if you go child-led, you get these creative things that we as adults would never think about. They said, we also want to do something for the old people in the village, because a lot of the old people were living on their own and they couldn't collect water, for example, or they couldn't go to the market to buy food, and they couldn't dig in their fields. So the children said, we don't just want to do something to help ourselves, we also want to help older people. And that's how the project started. So the children then formed their groups, 1 or 2 in Nshamba, and then they went to other children. And there's a wonderful book published by REPSI, which is called Child-Led Organizations. And it's full of these stories of children. And they talk about, we went to our children that we knew down the road and we asked them, and we never thought that they would join the group, but they did. And eventually there was this organization of children with about 3,500 children in 4 or 5 villages that formed and is still, in fact, operating slightly differently, called Tatu Tanu, which means 3 to 5 or 5 in Swahili, which is the number of children in each group. So it started in 2000 and it's still there. So I think that's quite exciting.
Thanks. So I guess I could ask you, well, this really sounds amazing. And obviously it's a sort of spread child to child, sort of by word of mouth, to end up with literally thousands of children part of these groups. But building on this, what actually was achieved? What were the outcomes from all of this child-led activity?
Well, the first time that I visited was in 2005. And one of the reasons I went there was to do an evaluation study. And it was quite a rigorous study where we did a quasi-experimental comparison group, which sounds like a big, complicated thing. But really what it was is we took children from the project and we then used children who hadn't been part of the project. And we did it in an ethical way so that those children would in the future become part of the project within that year. And we developed a number of mental health and psychosocial indicators of well-being. And we measured the impact of being part of the organization. And I think we'll put that evaluation report, if anybody wants to see it, up on the Community Exchange website. But what that evaluation showed is that First of all, the children had a much bigger social support network, which is a very key thing for mental well-being. So their support network was obviously because they were now in these groups. But we also found that because they were in the groups, they were also able to make a little bit more money. They actually were earning money within those groups. And so we looked at the amount of money that came into their households as part of the research. They also improved their confidence. Their emotional stress was reduced. We used a very simple emotional stress scale that's global. And the children who were part of the groups had a lower emotional stress levels than the children who weren't. Their coping skills were improved, their problem-solving skills. And maybe most importantly, we also did a community survey, and that was fascinating because what had happened over the years, and this was just 5 years now that the project had been running, is that the community's perceptions of these children had shifted. So before they were these poor orphan children who are naughty, and they come and beg at our door, and their parents died of AIDS. They were kind of these outcasts. Now people were saying, they're so responsible. They're part of this organization, and they look after the old people. That was the thing that really impressed them the most. So the children were, I suppose inadvertently, they hadn't thought about caring for the old people as something to show that they were good, but just by suggesting that, it had a huge impact. So I think even though the study was done some years ago, I think it's a very useful way of understanding each one of those things. You could trace back to the fact that it was child-led, because the confidence improved because they had to run the meetings. The emotional stress improved because it was less emotional stress because they had each other to talk to about their problems. So that's one of the ways, I suppose, you could say the impact. You could see the impact.
No, it's really, really interesting. So maybe just to summarize for people who are listening, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is a child-led initiative in this context is one where the children decided what was important to them, what were the things they wanted to do something about. And then they also decided the actions that they wanted to take. So adults were involved, and we'll explore that perhaps in our next question. So there were adults involved in this program, but they seem to take a bit of a back seat. Maybe you could elaborate on what was the role of adults. Were there adults? Who were these adults? And what did they do to help these children in their sort of child-led initiative?
So yes, there were adults. To begin with, there were only one or two. And even now, if you look at the Tatutanu groups, there's a very small number of adults compared with the number of children. And those adults the adult's role is very much as a supportive role. And first of all, the adults are a source of information. So, for example, one of the things that the children did quite early on was to save money. That was one of the things that they started to do as they were able to generate income. And they even had their own bank that was run by the children. So some of the older children were trained in how to do bookkeeping and banking. And at one stage, there was a bit of corruption happening. And the children were unsure about how to deal with that, the young people. So they went to some of the adults and said, will you help us? And with the adults' help, they developed a policy or a program, a process, I suppose you could call it, or mechanisms to stop that happening again. They also talked about disciplinary mechanisms for those that had been involved in it, that were ethical and careful and all those things. So the children had identified a problem and went to the adults. So they were supporting them. I think the adults also played a safeguarding role. So they had regular meetings with the children in large groups. The children would report back, and they would get a sense of what was happening in the different groups. So something like bullying, for example, within the group, very often the children, and I think this is something so important, you can trust children and young people to handle some of those issues in very ethical, careful ways.
Safeguarding. This is often something which is really concerning to a lot of people, practitioners, organizations who are thinking about using a community-led approach or even a child-led approach. There's this concern that maybe there are safeguarding issues which the community and or children won't be able to cope with, and that there is a sort of responsibility from the agency, let's say, to ensure that there is no harm done and that safeguarding is taken seriously, and that there are some mechanisms to ensure that. So can you just explain in the context of this initiative, like how the safeguarding happened?
Okay, so to begin with, it was mostly that the staff and the regular meetings that the young people held. So the groups of 3 to 5 were divided up into clusters according to their geographical area, and they would have regular meetings, which were run by some of the older children. Even some of the younger children sometimes were running them. Children as young as 10 or 11 or 12 would be the secretary or the chairperson of the meeting. So those regular meetings, there was an opportunity there was one of the staff members there from the organization, one of the adults, and all of those adults had been trained in the idea that they were supporters or facilitators. They weren't running the project. So they would say, if there are any things you want to talk about, I'm here for the next hour after the meeting, and you can come and talk to me, and it'll be confidential. And the children knew that they could trust these adults by that stage because they'd been part of their lives for a period of time. So that was how it started, how to begin with. It was just a kind of watchful eye, if you like, and the sense also that the older and younger children, there was 2 or 3 generations of children within the organization. So that they kind of also had a sense of safeguarding of each other. That was another thing. Then what happened was the children identified that sometimes there were issues that they couldn't deal with, that were too complicated, like sexual abuse, for example. They became aware of that. Or a child in the group who was being neglected or badly treated by someone within their family. And that just felt too big for them. So the children said, these problems are too big for us. And they had a whole discussion and decided that what they would do is they would, because also the adults of the organization were based in Nshamba, and some of these villages were quite far away where the children were running these groups. So it was, the children couldn't get to some of those adults sometimes to tell them that something was a problem. So what they did is they formed community child protection committees, which is a very common intervention in child protection. But the difference between these community child protection committees is the children, they had a whole process where each group identified who are the trusted adults in our community. Who do we feel we could go to and talk to? And the adults of the organization facilitated that process, and they wrote down the names of people that the children trusted. And they felt they would keep it confidential. And you know, there are always people like that in a community. There's always someone who is, in my experience of working even in schools, there's always a teacher somewhere who the children can trust, or somebody within the community. So then what the organization did is they wrote letters to these adults and said, the children have chosen you as one of the trusted adults. Would you be happy to be part of a child protection committee? And of course, when I interviewed the adults, when I wrote the case study that you'll find on the website for Tatutanu, and they really felt proud that the children had identified them. So they took their position very seriously, because now this was something that was entrusted to them by a group of children. And the children then report if something's too big for them to worry about, to deal with. They report to these adults, and the adults went through a training from the organization, also in how to recognize abuse in a child, what to do, what the referral mechanisms are, kind of a version of case management, I suppose. And they then report to the organization. And they meet quite regularly. They also meet with the children quite regularly. So I think that's quite a powerful example of using quite a common mechanism, but in a way that was child-led. So I think that's a very good example of child safeguarding within a child-led context.
Yeah, it's really, it's a very, for people who are used to working in that typical community child protection committee or welfare committee sort of community-based way, I personally haven't come across many examples where children decide to choose who's on the committee. Normally, there's a focus on something like, is it representative? Is there a man? Is there a woman? Is there a child? Is there an older person, a local leader, etc.? So this is a very different approach where the children actually create it. And I'm sure the representation of the different people on those committees looks quite different than if an agency came along and said, let's constitute one of these committees. So it's really, really interesting. And yeah, like Glynis said, we've got all of those studies on the website. I'll give you the details later, but you can go and read them for yourself. So maybe something I wanted to also explore that's just like this big question that always comes up is the issue of sustainability. And something we do know about our typical ways of working with communities at the moment in child protection is that there's often a problem with sustainability. It could be that once the program ends and the agency goes away, the child protection committee or the youth group or whatever it is that was set up as part of that project just tends to fade away. It can also mean that perhaps some of the practices that local community members were using with children for discipline, for example, while they sort of temporarily changed during the program, things revert back to how they were. So this is a big challenge, I think, for a lot of community-based child protection work. And I wondered, Glynis, if you could maybe just explore that a bit within the context of the Tatu Tanu project in Tanzania, and just tell us if you think this was sustainable, and if so, how.
Well, first of all, this project in some form or another has been kind of in two forms, if you like, has been running for 23 years. So I think that already shows that it's sustainable, and it's been through times where there was good funding and the ability to not have too many adults, but to have adults' involvement and money for transport, things like that. But it's also been through times when there hasn't been large amounts of funding and the groups have continued. And I think there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. And so that's something we can learn from. The one is the project has become generational. So it from the very beginning, it focused on the idea that the young people, the older children, if you like, were able to, they could use their skills and their knowledge and the fact that they were older to support the younger ones. So that was built in from the very beginning. The older group would meet, the sort of 14 to 18-year-olds would meet separately in their cluster groups, and then the small children would meet in the original. So what's also happened, though, is as the project has progressed, the older generation have become the ones that lead certain parts of the project. So that's made it sustainable. The best example of that, I think, is that the girls, the young women, at one stage approached the adults in the organization and said, we have this terrible problem with gender-based violence. The boys are harassing us. Sometimes the boys are even physically attacking us, and we don't know what to do. So together the young people and the organization developed the Empowering Girls program, which now operates. The girls meet regularly in schools, in the different villages, once a week. They do some physical activity, which gets them kind of their bodies becoming more assertive. And they also learn how to report things. They learn about their right to be able to say no. There's lots of, they shout hapana, which is Swahili for no. So those groups meet quite regularly, and they also talk about their issues and their problems. But interestingly, that whole program has one adult that supports it, and it's run in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, maybe even 10 villages. But it's run by 2 or 3 young women who used to be part of the project. So they've now sort of graduated, and they're running the project. And those young women are going to stay in the village, even if the adults disappear. So they're going to carry on running that program, and in the next generation. So I think the intergenerational nature of this particular project has created sustainability. I also think an important thing is that the priorities have shifted over the years. So if you're really listening to children, you're going to change there's going to be an organic change over time. So the objectives that you had at the beginning, this program was started when orphanhood was an issue. So it focused very much around children who were isolated within the community. Now, the bigger issues in that community are very deep poverty and food insecurity, partly because of global economics. The cost of food has skyrocketed, and there's been, the staple food is banana, the green bananas, and the banana trees have been affected by a disease that is throughout that area of Tanzania. So the food security is much lower. So the children then started to say, we need proper income generation projects. This cutting grass or working in someone's field doesn't make enough money for us to buy school shoes or to buy food for our families. So they started proper income generation projects with the support of adults. And they do this still in their groups of 3 to 4. And they have mostly livestock, small livestock programs. So they'll keep goats or rabbits. Chickens are a bit more difficult to keep because they get sick quite a lot. But so the little group of 3 or 5 will have 2 goats. And what happens is they go through a training, and then they're given a loan to buy the goat. And then they save as a group, and they put the money back. They pay the money back. And that's been incredibly successful. And interestingly, this is a nice example of how they use adults to support the young people. They have an agricultural advisor who is, in fact, a graduate of the program. He was originally one of the original members of one of the original groups. And he was then sent to agricultural college, and he learned how to keep small livestock. So he's there as an advisor. And the meeting that's described in the case study, the Tatutanu case study that I went to, he was the only adult. The children ran this group. There were about 100 children sitting under a tree outside a school. And after they dealt with all their business, everybody reported back on what they'd done. Then they had a thing where different groups added their savings, and their savings were all recorded, small shillings sometimes. But then they had any questions. And this little girl of she couldn't have been more than 10, she got up and she said, my 2 goats, have got this sickness. And she described what was wrong with them. And then the agricultural advisor said, oh, have you tried this? There was a local herb. And she said, no, she hadn't tried that. So he said, try that. And if that doesn't work, come to me. And as part of the funding, there was a stock of particular medicines that could be used for the goats. So that person also advised on markets. So there was quite a lot of beekeeping, but how do you sell lots of honey in a very remote place? So he knew about markets and how to get things to market. So the children ran their own income generation projects. So the 10-year-old had a 13 and 14-year-old, and they kept their 2 goats. But then they had this adult who could advise them on what to do properly. So I think to go back to your point about sustainability, it's that intergenerational, but it's also about changing the nature of the program led by the children. So the issue of orphanhood was less of a problem, but now the program had changed to something that the children really needed. Yeah, I mean, I
Thanks.
think there's still a need for some funding. As you can see, I mean, there's some adults that need to be paid, there's some transport that needs, but it should be able to sustain some of the core activities, I think, without funding.
Yeah, I mean, what I understand from that is we've got a initiative here which is run for 23 years, more or less. It's almost become, yes, this intergenerational type project where children grow up to become young adults and then become part of that initiative in a slightly different way. And that it's kind of got this very flexible approach in that over time, priorities change, focuses change, and so does the initiative. And this is a very unusual, well, it almost seems like it becomes part of that community's social fabric as opposed to something which might be termed an NGO project or a project per se. It's something that everybody's involved in and just does as a matter of course. But that raises, yes, a lot of issues and questions around funding, because clearly this is not the typical way that we, let's say, in an agency might approach funding or a project or asking for funding. So could you maybe tell us, you did mention that there are adults involved in the initiative and they do get paid some salaries, and there are some other small costs as well involved with transport, etc. So can you tell us a bit more about what the story is with funding for a project like Tatutanu? How do they approach it?
Well, obviously there are some costs, and I think this project has struggled actually to be funded at some points in its history, and I think that's because it's, first of all, it's in a very remote area, and I think it's very interesting if you map where NGO child protection type projects are. They're often in places that people can easily reach. They might be in rural areas, but this is a very remote community. And I think that it means donors can't easily visit it, so they can't easily see it. It takes a couple of 2 aeroplanes and whatever to get there, or a long bus ride and a taxi ride. So I think that's one of the reasons why they've struggled, and I think that's a little bit of it's really important that funders, also donors, think about very remote areas, and they need to be included. That's kind of one of my things, is this idea that you have low-hanging fruit. And I think that's often how funding is done. And that's just I always think, well, what about the children in the remote areas? They're not low-hanging fruit. They actually, you've got to climb the tree to get to them. So that's one of my least favorite terms. So that's one reason. I think also the model doesn't fit donor models. I mean, it's got very clear objectives. It's got very clear processes and mechanisms for the way it works. It's got very clear recording. It's had some good evaluations, but it doesn't fit the idea that you have a program for a particular thing, like child protection. And it does child protection, but it does it in a different way. And it isn't easily ticked as we've done this or we've done that. So I think it's a real challenge to donors to say, you need to think out of the box about, if you really want to do something that fits with the way a community, something that's community-led, it's not going to look like the kinds of projects that we used to. And it's really important to look at being flexible in how you fund these kinds of programs. For small grants that could fund, for example, the GBV program, the organizations struggle to get small grants. It's much easier for donors to have a big project, and the organization's not necessarily able to manage large amounts of money, but it could do with small grants, for example. So I just think it's sad in a way that there's not the flexibility that to fund these really innovative, organic programs.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point, the last point you made about they don't particularly want a big grant. They just want a small grant to do the small things which are required to just keep the adults and the program running. But the children are really doing most of the work, and they don't do that for money. They do that between themselves, for themselves. So there's also this idea of not needing a big dump of money to make projects necessarily work sustainably or even effectively. It's actually just having a strategic use of money. And it's a very big mind shift to think that we can run a sustainable and effective program, but with very little money. So even when we're speaking to donors, we're not necessarily saying, oh, you have to channel millions and millions of dollars into this kind of approach. We're actually saying, just look at how you fund and maybe change some of those models. But probably even for a donor, that's quite challenging, because delivering small amounts of money is a lot of work. And it's relatively more work than delivering a large amount of money.
Sure.
So there's obviously some changes that need to happen. Although not every donor is like that. There are donors that are starting to work like that. But Glynis, I wanted to ask you something, because you told me this story, a really great story about the children's meetings and the snacks they ate. And it was a really, really interesting and very useful story to hear. So I wondered if you could just tell us that story.
This is a story that Kurt tells and has really influenced the way I work and think ever since I heard him tell the story. So when the group first started, the 17 young people and children that he got together, he had a colleague from the local community who was working with him. And at the meetings that they held in that first week, they would stop for tea and mandazi. And mandazi are these little, almost like donuts. They're fried, doughy, sweet treats. And so the children would have mandazi and tea. And during the time they were working, the one meeting, they had biscuits that were bought, or cookies that were bought from the shop in a packet. And Kurt and the children and everybody in Tanzania talks about biscuits, not biscuits. So they're called biscuits. So these biscuits didn't get eaten. The children didn't eat them. Maybe one or two were eaten, but when the children went home, Kurt said to his colleague, I see the children didn't eat the biscuits. And she said, no, they didn't. So Kurt said to her, what made you decide to buy biscuits? And she said, well, I just thought they were tired of mandazis and they would like a change. And Kurt says they then had this discussion about the fact that she had thought that the biscuits would be a good idea. She didn't ask the children. And that's become something that the organization uses to sort of symbolize almost, have you asked the children? So we're gonna do a gender-based violence program. Well, is it a biscuit? Have you asked the children? Have you asked the young people? Do you want biscuits or do you want mandazi? So I've used that now, and I often say to people in the program that I'm working on in Mozambique, all my colleagues there use the idea of a biscuit, and they'll say to each other, so you think this Children's Day thing, is it a biscuit, or did you ask the community, do they want it? And I think there are a lot of child protection programs out there that are biscuits, because nobody asked anyone, do you want this program? So it's become a kind of little rallying call, if you like, in my head. And I say it to myself too, is this a biscuit, Glynis? Or is this something that you asked the children whether they want to do this or not? Or have you asked the community that you're working in? It's such a powerful little story, I think.
It is. It's a great story. And I think it links back also to what we were talking about earlier, the sustainability, the idea of sustainability. what we've learned from community-led child protection so far is that if the agencies give the space and the time for communities to really reflect on what are the priorities for them, what's important for them, and what do they want to address, and in this case, what do the children want to address? Often those priorities are not exactly the same as an agency priority, but because they are actually acting on something which is very, very important to them, it's more likely to be sustainable because it's something that people are deeply invested in, as opposed to something maybe a little bit different or foreign that is introduced from an outside agency or NGO. So I like the biscuit story because it really reminds us to always ask what is important to you, what do you want to do, and not to assume that we know what those things should be, because we can give people biscuits, but people won't necessarily eat them. So that's a great story. I think maybe just to wrap up a bit, just to summarize really what we've been talking about so far, it's been a really fascinating account of a long-term child-led initiative. And in this initiative, children have really been given that space, that power to take the decisions, and also to decide what are their priorities, and to allow those priorities to shift over time. And in fact, over more than 2 decades. I think that's so interesting, the idea of this work becoming almost intergenerational, and older children growing up into young adult facilitators. So maybe just before we finish, what would be really useful, Glynis, from you is if you were going to highlight for anyone listening to this podcast right now, what are sort of maybe the 3 main takeaways that you'd want them to bear in mind from this discussion?
So the first thing I think would be is to just say to ourselves that children can do this. They can be responsible. They can, and they're very creative if we ask them. So I think for me, this project and other projects I've seen that have been led by children, there's a feeling that they can do this. We shouldn't doubt them. That would be the one thing. The second thing would be, I think the intergenerational idea is very important. Use the different generations of children. Work with the idea that the younger ones have something particular to bring. The older ones have something particular to bring. The graduates of the program have something particular to bring. I think that's a very powerful idea of thinking through age and obviously also gender. I also think the third thing is that the adults in this program, in this example, were supportive. So they were there and they responded when they were needed, but they didn't take over. So for me, those would be the three kind of key things: believing that children can do it, using the differences between children to make it. So I suppose it's being inclusive, the different generations, and the other one is that the adults were supportive rather than in power.
Thanks, Glynis. Yeah, really, really interesting and useful guidance. I've really learned a lot. I always learn a lot every time I talk to you. So thank you so much for spending the time just to unpack a little bit this inspiring example, and wishing you the best of luck for another 23 years of Tatu Tanu.
Thanks, Lucy. It's been such a privilege talking about this program. It's really influenced my thinking as a person, as a human, and as a person who works with children and communities. So it's been lovely to be able to tell you about it.
This podcast was made possible thanks to the Child Resilience Alliance with a grant from Oak Foundation. It was produced and hosted by myself, Lucy Hillier of the Community Child Protection Exchange. Original music was composed and performed by Jay Bones. Thanks, and see you next time.